Bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantlybookish. I'm Marissa, and I am here today with a very massive reading wrap-up for you. You may or may not have noticed that I haven't really been discussing much of what I've read in the second half of 2021 on my channel. I just haven't been making my monthly reading wrap-ups, and I'm finally ready to discuss all of the books that I read in the second half of 2021 with you. There are a lot of them. Some of them I will talk about in more depth than others because I have more to say. Some of them I've already moved on from and don't feel the need to discuss in too much detail. So I hope you enjoy. Why don't you grab yourself something cozy to wear, nice cup of tea, a delicious snack, and just sit back and relax as I regale you with what I read in the second half of 2021. This may end up being 2 videos. I'm not sure how long this is going to take, just FYI. So I may as well start with some of the books that I read in the month of August. One of the books I read in the month of August was The Mercies by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. This is a historical fiction book that takes place in a small village in Norway in 1617. After an unprecedented, vicious storm kills off all of the village's men, the women are left grieving and unprepared to support themselves in the harsh environment. They work hard, teaching themselves to fish and be self-sufficient, and they're finally beginning to thrive and resume a new sense of normalcy when the government sends an official named Absalom to restore order. Absalom is a God-fearing man from Scotland who's famous for his experience with witch trials, and with his arrival comes a new way of life in the village, full of suspicion and accusations in the name of God. We follow 2 female characters, Marin and Ursa, as they band together to survive this man's iron rule. I found the premise of this book to be very fascinating. It's apparently based on the real events of the Vardo storm and witch trials of 1621. Unfortunately, though, I thought the execution of this book was a bit lacking. I didn't quite click with the writing style. I found the sentences to be a bit clunky and meandering in a way that seemed muddled. A lot of the sentences go on forever, and even the shorter sentences have lots of extra clauses separated by commas. I just found the writing to actively detract from the story in many places, especially towards the beginning of the book. I also wasn't the biggest fan of the ending. I found that it built the main relationship in the story up to an unsatisfactory loose end. All in all, I found the whole story to have so much potential that it didn't live up to that potential for me. But the book was okay. I'm just annoyed because I could envision how, with some additional tweaks, this could have been a truly outstanding book, practically perfection, and on my best of 2021 list. That being said, I know a lot of people on BookTube really enjoyed this book and liked it a lot better than I did. So if the premise sounds interesting to you, don't listen to me, pick it up for yourself and see what you think. In August, I also read some Bronte poetry for the Bronte project, and I was blown away with Emily's poems specifically. I enjoyed Anne and Charlotte's poems as well, but of course Emily is known as the poet of the family for a reason. I'm not really a poetry person in the same way that I'm a novel person. I have trouble discussing poetry, comparing poets, or talking about collections as a whole, but I do appreciate good poetry when I read it, and I specifically appreciated Emily's. I filmed a short little video reading To Imagination, which was one of my favorite poems of Emily's that was in my short collection. You can check it out if you want to experience some cozy fall Bronte vibes. I'll link it in the description below. Another book that I read in August was The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley, which made it to my best of 2021 video. If you've already seen that video, this might be a little repetitive, and if you don't want to hear me absolutely rave and rant about The Kingdoms again, feel free to skip ahead. But if you haven't heard me talk about it yet, The Kingdoms is a phenomenal book. The book takes place in 1898 in an alternate world where England has lost the Battle of Trafalgar. It lost the Napoleonic Wars and is a French colony now. We follow the main character, Joe, who walks off a train in London with severe amnesia. He takes a little while to find who he used to be, and it turns out that he is a slave and he's returned to his French family. One day he receives a peculiar 100-year-old postcard that somehow has a picture of a newly constructed lighthouse on the front. It's written in illegal English, and it says, "Dearest Joe, come home if you remember me. Signed, M." Joe feels this strange sense of deja vu, and he feels like he might remember an obscure name, Madeline. Is that who the M is? He really wants to know, and he risks everything to uncover the mysteries of this postcard, of its author, and it's his own past. I'm obsessed with the Kingdoms. I still think about it all the time. I absolutely love Natasha Pulley's writing, and I think that this is her best work to date. It takes so many themes that Natasha Pulley has explored in her other works, but it explores them even more deeply in this one. It looks at identity, memory, and time in really brilliant ways, and it has possibly the best love story that I've ever read. Like Natasha Pulley's other books, this one doesn't fit into a neat genre. It's a bit of historical fiction with some sci-fi, fantasy, and mystery elements thrown into the mix. I feel like I can't tell you much more about this brilliant book without spoiling something, so I'll stop talking about it specifically, but Natasha Pulley is one of my favorite contemporary authors, and this is my favorite book of hers. I think that you can enjoy this book without having read her previous work, but I think that it was a deeper, more enriched experience because I'm familiar with some of her other works. Her other books, The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, Bedlam Stacks, and The Lost Future of Pepper Harrow are all part of a series. This is not part of that series, but like I said, it has a lot of similar themes, and you might understand the book a little better if you're familiar with her work. And the last book that I read in August was The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This is a book that I've heard discussed quite a bit on BookTube, and I was never really interested in it. It's about a 16-year-old African-American girl named Star who navigates the balance between the two worlds of Garden Heights, the poor neighborhood where she lives, and the wealthy private school in the suburbs that she attends. The separation and balance between these two worlds is shattered when she witnesses her childhood best friend die at the hands of the police. Suddenly, the incident is in the headlines, and people from both of Star's worlds want to know exactly what happened that night. Star is forced to decide whether she should speak up and speak out, even if it might upend her community, change the way people perceive her, and possibly even endanger her life. When people describe this book, much like I just did, it sounded like a story I have heard before. I wasn't convinced that it had anything new to add to the conversation about these topics and themes. I was worried because the characters sounded like horrible stereotypes. Plus, it's marketed as a YA book, which is not usually my literary wheelhouse. But I listened to it on audiobook, mostly as a whim, because Bahni Turpin narrates it, and she did such a wonderful job of the narration of Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, and I couldn't wait to hear her voice again, so I gave this book a try. I have to say I was pleasantly surprised by this book. Its characters were complex and nuanced and believable. They fought back against the stereotypes that they could have easily been pigeonholed into. The writing is deceptively simple and approachable for how masterfully it delves into the nuances of racism in our society. I feel that fiction is more real than reality sometimes, and this is one of those instances. Fiction has the power to transport you into another person's world. It's the closest you can come to sharing their lived experiences. Fiction can give you an emotional connection to the subject matter in a way that news simply can't, and novels have the extraordinary power to cultivate empathy and understanding for those who are very different from you. This is a book that uses that power of fiction more successfully than most, and frankly, I think this should be required reading for people of all ages right now. I wouldn't be surprised if this one ends up being a classic. Moving on to the month of September, I read And the Mountains Echoed by Khaled Hosseini. I already talked about this plenty in my favorites of 2021 video, but just briefly, it's a series of interconnected short stories. It might be marketed as a novel, but really it's an amalgamation of these little snippets of different characters. In the beginning of the book, we witness a separation of two children, a brother and a sister, from a small village in Afghanistan, and we see how that family is affected and how it affects those around them from the 1940s all the way through the 2010s. It spans countries from clearly Afghanistan to Paris, Greece, and America. It's just a really rich and powerful collection. If you want to hear a little more about it, please do watch the Best of 2021 video. In September, I also read Confessions of a Jane Austen Addict by Laurie, Viera, Rigler. This is about a modern-day woman from LA who wakes up in the body and bedchamber of a real Regency woman. The main character, Courtney, is a self-affirmed Jane Austen addict and finds herself needing to play the part of this Regency woman and enduring life without the modern conveniences she's used to, like flushing toilets and electricity. Courtney starts to experience memories that are not her own, and she wonders if she'll ever get her real life back, and if she even wants it anymore. So I thought this book was a really fun, fluffy, and light read. I wouldn't call it great literature, but it's certainly a great adventure and entertaining for Jane Austen fans. One thing that I found odd, though, was the main character. I think it's really strange that someone who considers themselves a Jane Austen addict is so utterly clueless about the Regency era. She complains an awful lot about her predicament, and she engages in some pretty improper and inappropriate behavior. She's not respectful of the time period at all, and she keeps interjecting with 20th century language and attitude. Try to imagine Bridget Jones ending up in the Regency era, because it's kind of like that. That aside, though, it was a whirlwind of a read, full of lots of Jane Austen references. I can't say that it was the most historically accurate of books, because it wasn't, but it was still fun to see the famous pump room in Bath and enjoy Pride and Prejudice quotes sprinkled throughout the book, and even get to meet Jane Austen as a character. I enjoyed the author's sense of humor. It felt kind of like she and I were both making fun of the main character together and making fun of her lack of Regency knowledge while sharing in our own reverence for the time period. I'm excited to read the sequel to this one, which has the opposite premise. What if a Regency lady was transported into modern times? I wonder if the main character in the sequel is the same lady that Courtney becomes in this book. That would be interesting, but I'm not sure if that's what happens. Sometimes I enjoy randomly daydreaming about historical figures engaging with our modern world, so the sequel sounds right up my alley. And talking about this book makes me want to read that one. In September, I also read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte for the Bronte Project. What can I say about Jane Eyre? This book just holds such a special place in my heart. It was one of the first pieces of Victorian literature that I really connected with. It's a beautiful coming-of-age story with creepy Gothic elements and Jane as a character who I formed a strong connection with as a teenager. It's impeccably written, and every time I read Jane Eyre, and I've read it many, many times at this point, I find some new angle or aspect to the book to pay attention to. For those of you who haven't read it, please give it a try. It's a popular and well-beloved book for a reason. This time I paid attention to some new themes in Jane Eyre. I looked more carefully at the role of light and divinity of light, both in the Red Room scene and the Moon scene towards the end of the book. I thought more about surrogate parents and non-nuclear families in Jane Eyre more than I ever have before. There are so many characters who are searching for a home or a sense of belonging in this book. There's Bessie and Miss Temple, who are mother figures for Jane. There's Helen, of course, who's like a sister and a friend as well. And then there's the family that Jane creates for herself near the end of the book. And this time I paid more attention to Adele, Mr. Rochester's ward, and her slightly ambiguous parentage. Even Mr. Rochester has had issues with his family in the past, and he feels no particular connections for most of the book. And then, of course, I always find something new and complicated to examine with Jane and Rochester. Rochester's all about games and charades and puzzles when it comes to Jane. And I always ask myself why he goes through the trouble of inventing these facades instead of adopting a more transparent attitude towards their relationship. I also really examined the fairy tale and folklore in the book and its relation to Jane and Rochester. Jane Eyre is just such a brilliant read that it always gives me more to enjoy each time I revisit it, and this time was no exception. In September, I also listened to Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. I listened to this on audiobook, and I thought it was a really interesting introduction into the world of fungi. Merlin Sheldrake explores fungi in all their glory as surprising and neglected organisms. He recounts the role they play in our lives, giving us bread, alcohol, so many medicines, and even shaping human history. He discusses their ability to digest plastic, explosives, pesticides, and crude oil, and the breakthroughs that they have in eco-driven industry. He describes how fungi connect plants and transform the way we understand ecosystems. This book is full of interesting knowledge about fungi, but it's also really well written, and it asks us not to just learn about fungi, but to broaden our mindset and change our perspectives. Fungi challenge our ideas of intelligence and autonomy. Mycelial fungi don't have brains or nervous systems, yet they can seemingly make decisions, work around obstacles, and influence plants, animals, and humans to function in ways that benefit them. There's a lot of interesting stuff to learn about fungi that this book only touches on. And even what we know about fungi is only the tip of the iceberg. There are still over 90% of fungi that remain undocumented. Overall, I thought this was a fun read, but one that probably won't stick with me long term. And then it was Victober. I read some really great things in Victober this year, one of which was The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. This made it to my favorite books of 2021, so this might be a little repetitive again if you've seen that video, but this is just such a phenomenal piece of Victorian literature. It's an amazing detective novel. In some cases, it's considered the first and best English detective novel, and it's just so fun and funny. It's all about a diamond called the Moonstone that's stolen from a Hindu shrine. Years later, it's given to the plunderer's niece, Rachel Verinder, on the occasion of her 18th birthday. The night of Rachel's party, the Moonstone goes missing, and everyone who made an appearance at the party or is part of the Verinder household is suspect. And everything goes on from there in this really fast-paced whodunit adventure. This mystery is a lot of fun. It has some fantastic twists and turns, but it's really the narrative structure and wonderful characters that make the book so special. It's narrated from a few different perspectives, my favorite of which is Mr. Bettridge. He's a longtime servant in the Verinder household who narrates a good chunk of the book. He's so loyal and opinionated, and probably my favorite character in the book as a whole. He's also completely obsessed with Robinson Crusoe, and he treats that book like it's a prophetic text. It's absolutely hilarious. He consults Robinson Crusoe for all of life's quandaries, and I just absolutely love him. There's also Miss Clack, who narrates the second part of the book. She's this religious zealot, and she's constantly leaving these religious pamphlets in people's houses to try and get them to convert to her brand of Christianity. She's really over the top and absolutely hysterical. It took me a while to grow to like her, though, I will say. There's also the detective figure, Sergeant Cuff, who's brilliant. He's one of the first detective figures in English literature, and of course, he's amazing and right at the end of the book. But it's really not just the detective figure who plays the role of detective in this book. We hear from so many different narratives, and we learn all of these different suspicions from the narrations. There's plenty of characters who end up catching detective fever, as Mr. Bettridge puts it. And they encourage us to catch detective fever as well. We try and solve the mystery, and it's just a lot of fun to solve it along with the characters involved. The book explores some really interesting themes, including race and imperialism and physical difference in the Victorian period. Some of the characters who have physical differences are villainized by the narrators in some way, shape, or form, but their physical differences don't necessarily make them bad people or guilty of the crime in question. So it's interesting to see how that unfolds and how people view these characters. The book also looks at theft really interestingly, because this all started when the British claimed possession of the sacred stone from the Hindus. So what exactly is the crime? Is it the initial crime of stealing the stone from the Hindus? Is it the crime of stealing the stone from Rachel? What culpability and responsibility does Rachel have for that initial theft if she wasn't a part of it? You know, how much does the Moonstone truly belong to her? The story devolves from this initial curse of imperialism, and there's really an aspect of the novel that's concerned with that and concerned with the intrusion of British culture on other cultures. And yet, at the same time, there is still incredible racism towards the Indian characters in this book and, insensitivity towards other cultures. Anyway, this is just such a brilliantly constructed book. It has so many great facets and different avenues to explore. There's, the whole idea of the detective novel coming into existence. There's the imperialism and colonialism. There's a wonderful romance in here that I didn't even mention. There's the quirky characters. There's just so much to love about this book. And of course, for the Bronte project, I read Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte in Victober. Where do I even begin to talk about Wuthering Heights in a wrap-up like this? It should really have a video of its own. This is one of my favorite books of all time. It's a really uniquely structured novel. It's set on the wilderness of the English moors and follows the intense relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff and the repercussions of their relationship on subsequent generations. It's such an interesting book, and it's one of my absolute favorites of all time, despite my hatred of all the characters. The power and the intensity of this book is astounding, and I read it again and again, and I just keep finding new angles to explore and unpack. This tiny little description does not do this book justice, but if you want to hear more about it, I do have some very old videos that I worked very hard on at the time, which unpack the themes and characters of Wuthering Heights in depth. I'll leave them in the description box below, but I really should make an updated Wuthering Heights video at some point. I'm always afraid I won't do the book justice. Can you even do this book justice? In Victober, I also read the group read Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskell. I absolutely love the short stories of Gaskell's that I've read before this that aren't part of this collection. I read The Moorland Cottage before this, Lois the Witch, which was in this collection as well, and Christmas Storms and Sunshine, which is a really lovely short story for Christmas time, actually. It's this heartwarming Christmas tale about two rival families who live next door to each other, and through the circumstances in the story, they find common ground and come together for Christmas. It's just so heartwarming and so lovely, and I'm kind of sad that I didn't read it again this year around Christmas time. But now I have another favorite short story to add to this list, and that is The Old Nurse's Story, which features a mysterious, ghostly child who wanders the moors and lures children out into the cold. It was a particularly creepy tale that gave me quite a chill. Gaskell's Gothic tales are generally filled with secret marriages, demonic doubles, hidden manuscripts, haunted houses, mysterious disappearances, and all sorts of other wonderful Gothic tropes. Through these short stories, Gaskell explores what haunts and threatens the respectful Victorian mindset, and which of these threats still terrify us today. And as always, Gaskell's prose is beautiful and captivating and a joy to read. I really should read more Gaskell. There are still more short stories of hers I could get my hands on, and I should finally finish her novels. I still have Ruth and Sylvia's Lovers to go. In October, I also read The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen by Alan Moore. This is a comic series that takes place at the tail end of the Victorian era in 1898, and it features a whole host of characters from Victorian literature who are recruited for a spy mission for the mysterious leader of Britain's MI5. There's a recently divorced Miss Murray from Dracula, who's the first who's pressed into service by Campion Bond, the grandfather of James Bond. She's tasked with gathering the rest of the literary team, Captain Nemo from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Hyde from Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Invisible Man from H.G. Wells' famous book of the same name, and Alan Quatermain, who's from a series of Victorian novels that I'm not at all familiar with, written by H. Rider Haggard. This was just such a joy to read. It's full of literary references, some of which are obvious and some of which went over my head because they're rather obscure. And Alan Moore is nothing short of a genius. I left the reading experience with a lot of obscure Victorian content to look into. This book is meant for lovers of Victorian literature or lovers of comic books. But it touches on so many themes that are discussed in Victorian literature. It addresses opium addiction, imperialism, and Britain's influence on other cultures, women's treatment in society, respectability, you know, a lot of the major Victorian themes that I love to think about. And then there is the fun task of comparing Alan Moore's versions of these characters to the ones you're familiar with. I've only read Jekyll and Hyde and Dracula and The Invisible Man, but obviously the more characters you're familiar with, the more you'll get out of this book. The frame of this book is set up as characters joining up for a purpose and forming a league, which is a common device in comics. The Justice League, the Avengers, etc. But those leagues are made of heroes, and this league it's comprised of an addict, a serial killer, a rapist, a pirate, and a disgraced woman. And yet we kind of root for them and definitely enjoy reading about them. It makes you wonder what it says about us and our concept of heroism. It's such an interesting book, and it was a fantastic pairing to Victober this year, even though it is not exactly Victorian itself. This is apparently a very famous comic series that was also made into a movie, and somehow I had never heard about this before, but it was right up my alley. My husband ended up recommending this one to me, and he was shocked that it had never come up before in our conversations. Hello everyone, Editing Marissa here. I have decided that this massive wrap-up should be split into two parts, as I suspected it would need to be. So this is a good place to stop. We have gone through August, September, and October Victober reads, and so part 2 will feature November and December reads from 2021. I hope you've enjoyed this part of the video. Please do let me know in the comments if you read any of these books, what you think about them, do you agree with my assessments on them, and are you looking forward to reading any of them in the near future? I just love hearing all your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in another video very soon. Bye!